On September 2nd, we tragically lost 34 lives when the Conception dive boat caught on fire at 3:14 a.m. off the coast of my district in California. This was the worst maritime disaster in 70 years. My condolences go out to the families of those victims. Let me say that I'm very grateful to the Coast Guard for their help in the search and rescue operations, and to the NTSB for their continued investigation into what went wrong. And while I want to recognize the Coast Guard men and women for just doing a heroic job day in and day out on their mission, and I have a number of Coast Guard service members in my district that do an outstanding job, I must say that when you look at the track record of implementing the NTSB's recommendations, it is not a good track record. And since over the years, we've seen tragedy after tragedy after tragedy happen, and the Coast Guard has a track record of inaction. While it is my understanding the NTSB is still conducting their investigation, I am disturbed by some of the reporting following this tragedy. Admiral Timme, I'm particularly concerned by the fact that the NTSB has continuously, for many years, advocated for the Coast Guard to implement procedures to conducting regular inspections, reporting maintenance needs for all of the boats, systems, and crew training. Yet the Coast Guard has ignored many of these recommendations. What actions has the Coast Guard taken to make sure those recommendations are implemented? And why have they not been implemented to date?
Congressman, the Conception fire is absolute a tragedy, and our hearts go out to the family of the victims. And we look forward to a full and complete investigation with the Maritime Board of Investigation. To your question with regards to the NTSB's recommendations, we work with them side by side on the investigations we do. And when we come to a recommendation, the NTSB makes a recommendation in the framework of a protocol to make a safety recommendation. We would have to take that recommendation into a different framework, into the framework of not just the recommendation itself, but the rulemaking, the guidance, the workforce, and the ecosystem it would go into. In this particular case, after the Conception, I've chartered a team to look at immediately, without waiting for the Marine Board of Investigation, but immediately to look at that class of vessels after a 30-day inspection campaign on those type of vessels, come back, look at what we found without waiting for the full MBI, and make recommendations to me regarding their findings and what needs to change in the safety framework, including rules and policy around these passenger vessels. And that includes re-looking at the National Transportation Safety Board's recommendations with regard to that. And I look forward to doing that.
Thank you. It's been brought to my attention that the Conception was working under old T, quote unquote, old T safety requirements, meaning they were not following the most up-to-date safety rules. What are some of the safety implications to continue to operate under this framework? And why do we need to wait until another tragedy to change our current safety rules?
Congressman, the old Subchapter T and new Subchapter T both have many vessels in the fleet that operate under those construction standards. They are valid construction standards today, as long as the vessels continue to be maintained in accordance with as constructed under that regime. To your question, we do not have to wait moving forward to look at what needs to change in that subchapter. In fact, that team I referenced will look at that, including if the Marine Board of Investigation finds that there was a point that had to do with the old construction standard, we will absolutely look at that.
Thank you. Mr. Curtis, do you care to add to that?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. Certainly, we've issued recommendations the past in these areas, particular to the conception. We're going to take a close look in this investigation at subchapter T, as the Admiral alluded to, not just for the existing and the old T, new T, but whether even the new T is adequate, whether it, as it addresses means of escape, crew responsibilities, and the likes of that. So certainly, this is a tragedy, and we're taking a close look at all these regulations, a fresh look at old subchapter T, new subchapter T, just for the validity of that very subchapter to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
Thank you very much to both of you. Mr. Chair, I yield back. Mr. Sturpkow, in relation to the conception tragedy off the coast of my district, how does accountability improve overall maritime safety?
Accountability, and it extends beyond the maritime setting. It's particularly important in the maritime setting because there is no incentive on the part of vessel owners and operators to ensure that their vessels are safe, they're staunch, they're seaworthy, unless there are consequences in the event that they set sail and they're not. Accountability breeds attention to detail. Accountability breeds compliance with rules and regulations. We've heard a lot today from the Coast Guard, from the NTSB, from these various organizations who all do good work and have done good work for a long time. The problem is that despite this good work, we repeatedly see one maritime disaster after another. And the problem is that at the end of the day, if the vessel owner knows, regardless of the severity of the catastrophe, it can either limit its liability or walk away with no liability, then there's really no incentive at the end of the day to ensure that these vessels are fit for their intended purpose.
It seems to me that the Limitation of Liability Act is no longer relevant to today's maritime industry given the advances in technology and changes in the ability of insurance and the corporate structure. It has outlived its purpose. Would you agree?
I totally agree. It was originally enacted in 1851 when we were a fledgling country trying to compete in maritime commerce with European powers, at a time when boats were wooden, cargo was routinely ruined, and boats caught fire and sank in a matter of minutes. There was no modern communication. There was no ability of a vessel owner to control his ship once it left port. All of those considerations are now gone. Vessel owners can call ships, regardless of their location in the world, by cell phone, just as you and I would talk by cell phone in Washington, D.C. We track ships in real time. We know exactly where they are. We know exactly where they're going. Vessels crews are much better trained. They have safety management systems. The notion that there is an innocent vessel owner who needs to be protected from perils out of his control has long since passed, and all the Limitation of Liability Act does now, in addition to eliminating accountability, is it limits the liability of the marine insurer because none of these boats leave port without insurance. So what you're really doing is protecting the insurance industry and not the people riding the vessels.
Thank you. How do you propose we fix the law?
Limitation of liability is simple. It can be amended to eliminate the ability to limit liability in cases of injury or death. Very simple fix. You remove the problem, you increase the accountability. In terms of the Death on the High Seas Act, my recommendation would be to extend damages to include the pre-terminal pain and suffering of the person who unfortunately is the victim of a marine disaster, and extend to the survivors the right to sue for what we typically call wrongful death damages. Those are damages for say if a child is killed, the parents of that child cannot sue at this point for their losses, for their emotional distress, loss of care, comfort, and companionship. The parents and the survivors of decedents in this situation should be permitted to recover those damages. And by the way, there is precedent for this. In 1996, Congress carved out what's called the commercial aviation exception to the Death on the High Seas Act following the TW-800 disaster. If you remember, it went into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Long Island, and a group of students from Pennsylvania were killed. And when their parents learned that their recovery in that case was limited to funeral and burial expenses, It created a situation that ultimately made its way to Congress, which ultimately led to what's called the commercial aviation exception, which allows parents to recover their damages for the loss of a child in the limited case of a commercial aviation disaster more than 12 miles off the coast. My fix is very simple. Extend that to all disasters falling under DOSHA. There's no reason to treat a plane disaster different than a boat disaster. And after all, the vast majority of these cases involve vessels and not airplanes.
Thank you very much for that thorough answer.